What would you do if your own daughter tried to rip away a $250 million family company at your husband's funeral? Betrayal doesn't get darker than this. If you've ever lived through family greed or witnessed betrayal that cut to the bone, drop a comment and share your story. And if you're watching this from the very beginning, type "I'm here" in the comments so I know you're part of this journey. The church bells had just faded into silence, yet their echo lingered like a bruise across Eleanor Hastings' chest. Street Mark's cathedral, so often a place of comfort, had become a stage for humiliation. Friends, colleagues, business partners of her late husband had all gathered to honor Thomas, the man who built Hastings Group from nothing but grit and a vision. And in the middle of this sacred goodbye, their only daughter, Vanessa, had carved into her heart with words that could never be undone. "The $250 million company is mine. My father built it for me. Nothing is left for you, mother." The words still rang in Eleanor's ears, louder than the organ, sharper than the whispers that swirled through the pews. Faces she had known for decades turned toward her with pity, curiosity, and disbelief. Some shook their heads. Some avoided her eyes. Others stared openly, eager to see whether the widow would crumble under the weight of her daughter's betrayal. But she did not. Her spine stayed straight, though her hands trembled in the folds of her black dress. Her eyes, wet but unyielding, remained locked on the coffin of her husband. Because if she looked at Vanessa, if she truly looked, she feared she would break. Michael Dalton, her husband's most trusted legal counsel, had stepped forward, his voice carrying across the nave with a steadiness that cut through the chaos. "Not today," he declared, reminding everyone that the battlefield was not this cathedral, not in the shadow of Thomas's casket. Eleanor had felt gratitude swell in her chest. Gratitude and grief and something else, something that scared her, a flicker of resolve. The service resumed, but it was no longer about Thomas. It had become about Eleanor and Vanessa, mother and daughter, bound by blood but torn apart by greed. Afterward, when the mourners spilled out into the gray Seattle afternoon, Eleanor felt the damp wind bite her skin. People pressed her hands, murmuring condolences that now rang hollow. Words like "so sorry for your loss" tangled with whispers of "did you hear what she said?" Her grief had been hijacked, transformed into spectacle. Dalton walked beside her, his jaw set. "We'll talk soon," he said quietly, almost like a vow. Helen Moore, her dearest friend and former judge, pressed Eleanor's arm. "Stay strong. The world just watched a daughter dishonor her father's funeral. People don't forget scenes like this." Eleanor managed only a nod. Vanessa didn't approach her mother after the service. She stood by the limousine with Claudia Reynolds, her partner in both business schemes and social performance. Vanessa's smile was brittle, but her eyes glittered with defiance. To anyone else, she looked victorious, like a woman who had claimed her inheritance in front of an audience that mattered. To Eleanor, she looked lost. That night, the house on Queen Anne Hill was unbearably quiet. The room still smelled faintly of Thomas's cologne, the mahogany shelves lined with his books, the desk stacked with his meticulous notes. Eleanor wandered from room to room as though searching for him, her hands brushing the furniture as if his touch lingered there. Grief pressed against her ribs like a stone, but beneath it, another feeling grew raw, unfamiliar, dangerous. It was anger, not the kind that flared and burned out, but the kind that simmered, steady and unrelenting, the kind that whispered, "Enough." She poured a glass of water and sat at the oak desk Thomas had always called the captain's helm. For years, she had watched him sit there, steering the company through storms, through markets that threatened collapse, through betrayals from competitors. She used to think the fortress was him, the man himself. Now, sitting in his chair, she realized the fortress might have been something else. She opened the bottom drawer and found the leather briefcase Thomas had told her about in hushed tones years ago. She had dismissed it then, brushing off his warnings as unnecessary. "Just in case, Eleanor," he had said. "You'll thank me someday." Her fingers trembled as she undid the clasp. Inside, neatly stacked, were documents thick with legal seals and signatures. At the top lay a note in Thomas's hand. "If you're reading this, it means you need protection. Remember, foresight is love, Eleanor. This is my last way of holding you up when I can't stand beside you." Her throat tightened. She pressed the note to her lips, tears spilling freely now. She had been blindsided by Vanessa's cruelty, but Thomas, always the strategist, had not been blind. He had known. He had prepared. But was it enough? Could a trust, no matter how solid, withstand the storm of her daughter's ambition, the venom of lawyers like Blackwood, the appetite of creditors circling like vultures? Eleanor closed the case, her breath steadying. She knew tomorrow she would call Dalton, show him what Thomas had left behind. She would meet Helen, seek her wisdom, and perhaps even lean on young Lily, whose sharp eyes saw truths others overlooked. But tonight, she allowed herself to sit in the silence of her home, the city lights flickering beyond the window, the rain tapping softly against the glass. She whispered to the darkness, "Thomas, I will not let her destroy what you built, not while I still have breath." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, and then an unexpected sound. The faint buzz of her phone on the desk. Eleanor glanced down, her heart jolting. A new voicemail, unknown number. She pressed play, and a voice, hurried and low, spilled into the quiet. "Mrs. Hastings, you don't know me, but you need to hear this. Your daughter Vanessa, she's in deep, deeper than you realize. If you don't act fast, it won't just be the company she's after, it might be your life." The line went dead. Eleanor sat frozen, the phone still in her hand, her pulse thundering in her ears. Her daughter had already shattered her heart. Now the question loomed in the midnight air, sharp as glass. What else was Vanessa capable of? The voicemail played over and over in Eleanor's head long after the line went dead. The stranger's voice, urgent and raw, echoed in the silence of her study. "Your daughter is in deep. If you don't act fast, it won't just be the company she's after. It might be your life." She sat in Thomas's chair, the leather still warm beneath her palms, as though his presence lingered there. The rain outside thickened, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Eleanor replayed the message again, straining for clues. The voice was male, mid-30s perhaps, rushed as if spoken from a moving car. No name, no number, just a warning, and then nothing. Her first instinct was disbelief. Vanessa might be cruel, ambitious, reckless with money, but could her own daughter truly be dangerous? Could she push her betrayal beyond inheritance, beyond power plays, into something darker? Eleanor shook the thought away, ashamed at even considering it, yet the tremor in her hands betrayed her fear. The next morning, she rose early, the city still cloaked in mist. With a thermos of black coffee and the leather briefcase Thomas had left her, she drove downtown to Dalton's office. The old lawyer was already at his desk, spectacles perched low on his nose, his tie slightly askew. He looked up as she entered, reading her expression before she even spoke. "You've listened to it, haven't you?" Dalton asked quietly. She nodded. "I don't know who it was, Michael, but they sounded terrified." Dalton leaned back, fingers steepled. Thomas suspected Vanessa might attract trouble. The debts she racked up weren't pocket change. We're talking hundreds of thousands, possibly millions. When you deal with that level of debt in this city, Eleanor, you're not borrowing from banks anymore. You're borrowing from people you don't want to owe. Her stomach sank. "Are you saying she's tied to criminals?" Dalton didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The silence was loud enough. That afternoon, Eleanor met Helen at her home, a cozy brick house overlooking Lake Union. Helen listened as Eleanor explained the voicemail, her sharp mind dissecting every word. Lily, Helen's granddaughter, sat nearby with her laptop open, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she searched records. "I found something," Lily announced after half an hour. "Vanessa has a lien filed against her by a private lender out of Tacoma. The company's name is just a shell, but dig deeper and it's tied to a man named Victor Rains." Helen's face hardened. "Rains runs half the underground lending in Washington. If Vanessa owes him, this isn't just about debt, it's leverage. He'll push her to claw at anything she can, your company included." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, as though she were falling. She gripped her teacup tightly. Her daughter, her only child, had entangled herself with wolves. That night, memories surfaced uninvited. She saw Vanessa as a little girl, running barefoot through the halls of the company headquarters, laughing as Thomas swung her up in his arms. She had once adored her father, idolized him, shadowed him in every boardroom meeting she could sneak into. Back then, her eyes had sparkled with curiosity, not greed. Where had it gone wrong? Perhaps it was college, when Vanessa began chasing prestige more than knowledge. Perhaps it was when Thomas refused to hand her a high-ranking role she hadn't earned. Perhaps it was when she fell in with Claudia, who whispered promises of power and shortcuts. Eleanor would never know the exact moment the seed of betrayal was planted. She only knew it had grown roots so deep that now it threatened to strangle everything Thomas had built. In the days that followed, Eleanor kept a careful distance. She didn't confront Vanessa. Instead, she observed. Vanessa's public appearances multiplied, charity galas, press interviews, all carefully staged to cast her as the natural heir of Hastings Group. Claudia was always by her side, smiling like a woman who had already won. The media devoured it. Headlines painted Eleanor as a bitter widow clinging to control, while Vanessa was portrayed as the visionary daughter carrying on her father's legacy. Eleanor wanted to scream at the lies, but Dalton reminded her, "Do not fight in the court of gossip. Save your strength for the real court." Still, the whispers hurt. Friends she had dined with for decades now hesitated when they called. Investors sent polite but pointed inquiries. Even members of her church leaned in with sympathetic eyes, their pity disguised as prayers. One evening, as she walked the halls of her home, Eleanor stopped outside Thomas's study. The leather briefcase sat open on the desk, documents spread across its surface. She had read them once, twice, and now a third time. The trust was airtight, or so Dalton claimed, but the warning voice from the voicemail gnawed at her. She traced her fingers over Thomas's handwriting again. Foresight is love. Perhaps love was not just foresight, she thought bitterly. Perhaps love was also blindness, for had they not both been blind to the darkness growing inside their daughter? The following week, Dalton arranged a discreet meeting with an investigator, a man named Harris, rough around the edges but thorough. He slid a file across the table in Dalton's office. Inside were photographs of Vanessa, with Victor Raines, grainy, taken at night, but clear enough. Her daughter shaking hands with a man who looked like danger incarnate. Eleanor stared at the photos until the room blurred. "She's playing a dangerous game," Harris said. "Raines doesn't care about your daughter. He cares about Hastings Group. If she can't pay him back, she'll try to pay with something bigger, and if you stand in the way..." He let the sentence dangle. Eleanor closed the folder with trembling hands. That night, as rain lashed against her windows, she sat alone in her bedroom. She had spent 65 years believing family was unshakable, that blood bound tighter than any contract. But now, staring at those photographs in her lap, she realized family could also be the knife that cut the deepest. Still, there was no room for despair. She would not allow Thomas's empire, their life's work, to become ransom for Vanessa's mistakes. She would fight not just for herself, but for the legacy of a man who had trusted her to guard his vision. Yet as she extinguished the lamp, the voicemail whispered again in her mind, "It might be your life." And then, just before dawn, the phone rang. Eleanor jolted awake, heart pounding. The caller ID read unknown. She hesitated, then answered. A voice hissed through the line, different this time, but equally cold. "Mrs. Hastings, you should stop digging. If you don't step aside, accidents happen. Even widows can disappear." The line went dead. Eleanor sat in the dark, the phone shaking in her hand. Her daughter's betrayal was no longer just about greed. It was about survival. And the terrifying question that lingered as the sun rose over Seattle was this: was Vanessa protecting herself from her creditors, or had she already chosen to sacrifice her own mother? Eleanor Hastings had never thought a briefcase could feel so heavy. It sat on the desk in front of her, the leather worn smooth by Thomas's hands, the lock still gleaming faintly under the lamplight. Inside were the documents she had glanced at the night of the funeral, but now, after the phone threats and Harris's photos of Vanessa with Victor Raines, she opened them with trembling determination. The trust papers rustled softly as she spread them out across the desk. Legal jargon, thick paragraphs, and stamped seals covered each page. But even to her untrained eyes, one truth was undeniable. Thomas had anticipated this. He had locked Hastings Group into an irrevocable trust with her as sole trustee. No will could override it. No inheritance fight could dissolve it. Vanessa could scream in every courtroom from Seattle to Washington, D.C., and still the company would be untouchable if Eleanor stood her ground. Dalton arrived early the next morning, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he carried his briefcase. He examined the documents carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. After half an hour, he set them down with a small, approving nod. "He built a fortress, Eleanor," Dalton said. "Solid, impeccable. This trust isn't just paperwork, it's armor. He must have known Vanessa's hunger might turn dangerous." Eleanor's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to protest, to defend her daughter, but the memory of the threats on the phone silenced her. There were no excuses left. By afternoon, Helen Moore joined them. Her gray hair was pulled back into a bun, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. A retired judge, Helen had spent decades parsing lies from truth in courtrooms. She read the trust in silence, lips moving slightly as though cross-examining every line. When she finished, she looked at Eleanor with solemn respect. "Thomas was brilliant. He built you a wall so high even Vanessa can't climb it. But walls invite siege. Brace yourself, the attack will come another way." Lily, Helen's granddaughter, had tagged along, laptop tucked under her arm. She was only 23, but her energy filled the room with fire. She scanned the documents quickly, then leaned forward. "If Vanessa can't break the trust legally, she'll try to break you personally. Smear campaigns, social media, public pressure. That's how people fight when they can't win in court." Eleanor felt her throat dry. "Then what do I do?" Helen placed a hand over hers. "You hold steady. You don't fight every headline. You don't answer every lie. You keep your dignity. That, Eleanor, is your greatest weapon." For the first time since the funeral, Eleanor felt a flicker of something besides grief and fear. She felt resolve. The next few days blurred into long strategy sessions. Dalton explained the strength of the trust in plain terms, reassuring her again and again. Helen prepared Eleanor for the possibility of depositions and hearings, walking her through what to say and, more importantly, what not to say. Lily combed through Vanessa's public statements, noting every inconsistency, every exaggeration that might be turned against her later. Late one evening, Eleanor found herself alone in Thomas's study again. She stared at the shelves lined with his books on economics and leadership. She could almost hear his voice, steady, commanding, filled with the certainty of a man who believed in foresight. She whispered into the stillness, "I will carry it, Thomas. I'll carry it for you." But the fortress, no matter how solid, was not enough to quiet her fears. On the third night, as the city lights flickered below Queen Anne Hill, Eleanor received another message, this one not a threat, but a warning cloaked in riddles. A plain envelope had been slid under her front door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed words, "Fortresses fall from within." Her blood chilled. She showed it to Dalton and Helen the next morning. Dalton's jaw tightened. "They want to rattle you. Don't let them." Helen, however, studied the paper carefully. No postmark, no fingerprints, someone close enough to your life to know where you live and brave enough to approach your door. This isn't random intimidation, it's personal. Eleanor felt the walls of her home closing in. Even her sanctuary wasn't safe. That evening, Lily sat with her in the living room, scrolling through her laptop. "Look at this," Lily said, turning the screen. Vanessa's social media accounts were ablaze posts painting Eleanor as an unstable widow hoarding a company she couldn't possibly manage. Photos of Vanessa with Claudia at high-profile events filled the feeds, their captions dripping with charm and confidence. Public sympathy was tilting. "She's building a narrative," Lily explained. "If enough people believe it, investors might start pulling out. Board members could pressure you. Even if she can't take the company legally, she can weaken it until you have no choice but to hand it over." Eleanor's stomach twisted. This was exactly what Thomas had feared, not just legal battles, but the war of perception. Helen arrived the next morning with a newspaper under her arm. She dropped it on the table, the headline bold and unforgiving. "Widow Hastings, unfit to lead. Daughter claims she's protecting father's legacy." The fortress was strong on paper, but in the court of public opinion, it was already under siege. That night, Eleanor stood by her bedroom window, the lights of Seattle shimmering in the rain. She thought of the letter slipped under her door, of the anonymous warning voice on her phone, of the photographs of Vanessa with reins. The pieces formed a grim puzzle. Her daughter wasn't just reckless, she was desperate. Desperate people did dangerous things. Still, she held the trust papers close, pressing them against her chest like a shield. Thomas had given her the tools to fight. She would not falter. But even as she whispered promises to the memory of her husband, another thought gnawed at her. Fortresses don't fall from outside. They fall when someone inside opens the gate. 2 days later, as Eleanor prepared to meet Dalton downtown, she paused on the front porch. A car idled across the street, its windows tinted dark. The engine purred like a predator watching prey. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "Next time, we won't just watch." Eleanor's breath caught. And as she clutched her phone, staring at the car that slowly pulled away into the Seattle fog, one question struck her with terrifying clarity. Had the war for Hastings Group already spilled into the streets, and would her fortress be enough to save her life? Seattle's skyline glittered beneath a curtain of rain, but Eleanor Hastings saw only the shadows. She stood in the kitchen, clutching the morning paper so tightly the ink smeared across her fingertips. Her own face stared back at her from the front page, hollow-eyed, framed by a cruel headline. "Widow Hastings, the company's $250 million weak link?" The article dripped with poison. It painted her as fragile, unstable, a grieving woman clinging to power she could never manage. It quoted anonymous sources who whispered that Eleanor was forgetful, easily manipulated, prone to confusion, lies, all of it. Yet as she read, her chest tightened until it hurt. She dropped the paper on the counter, her breath shallow. This wasn't a courtroom battle. This was public execution trial by headline. Dalton arrived minutes later, jaw tight as he scanned the article. He folded the paper with deliberate care and set it aside. "Victor Raines is behind this," he said flatly. "Vanessa feeds him her version. He leaks it to reporters hungry for scandal, and the world swallows it whole." Helen entered soon after, umbrella dripping by the door. Her sharp eyes took in Eleanor's trembling hands. "They're trying to corner you, Eleanor. If they can't break you legally, they'll break your reputation. A woman branded as weak cannot hold a fortress, no matter how strong the walls." Eleanor forced herself upright. "Then I won't let them brand me." But her voice shook, betraying the storm inside. That evening, she sat in the living room with Lily, who scrolled through her phone, her brow furrowed. "It's everywhere," Lily muttered. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, hashtags about Hastings Group trending, number give Vanessa the company. They're painting you as a selfish matriarch strangling her daughter's future. Eleanor's breath caught. Strangling her future? Lily nodded, disgust in her tone. People love a story about youth versus age, ambition versus tradition. They're buying into Vanessa's narrative. Eleanor closed her eyes. She could almost hear Thomas's voice. "The fight won't always be about numbers, Ellie. Sometimes it will be about hearts, about who the people believe you to be." The memory cut deep. Days blurred into a fog of headlines and whispers. Reporters camped outside the Hastings mansion, their cameras flashing whenever Eleanor stepped outside. Talk shows debated her competence. Opinion columns asked if she was standing in the way of progress. Each word chipped away at her dignity. One afternoon, Helen found her sitting at the grand piano Thomas had once played. Eleanor's hands hovered over the keys, unmoving. "They've turned me into a villain," Eleanor whispered. "I buried my husband, and now I bury my name." Helen placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You are not their villain. You are their target, and there is a difference." That night, Eleanor turned on the television, only to see Vanessa's face glowing on the screen. Her daughter sat across from a polished news anchor, her expression a mask of sorrow. "I love my mother," Vanessa said sweetly. "But she isn't well. She's grieving. She doesn't understand that my father wanted me to continue his legacy. Hastings Group needs fresh energy, bold vision, not silence." The anchor leaned forward. "So you believe your mother is unfit to lead?" Vanessa hesitated just long enough for the cameras to capture her eyes shimmering with fake tears. "I believe my mother deserves peace, not the burden of leadership. I only want to protect what my father built." Eleanor gripped the armrest until her knuckles turned white. "Protect?" she hissed to the empty room. "You mean steal." Lily, watching beside her, slammed the remote down. "She's good. Too good. People will believe this." Eleanor turned away, her throat tight. "Then we need to be better." The next morning, Dalton convened them all in the study. Helen, Lily, and Eleanor sat as he laid out a strategy. "Vanessa is winning the public war," he admitted, "but the trust still holds. That's our weapon. We bide our time until court, then we strike. If we waste energy fighting every headline, we'll drown. But if we remain steady, if we let her noise expose her desperation, the law will speak louder." Eleanor nodded, but unease gnawed at her. "What if the court bends to the noise?" Dalton's voice was firm. "Then we remind the judge of one truth: the law does not bend to gossip." Still, the attacks grew harsher. Anonymous calls filled the nights. Reporters shoved microphones into Eleanor's face whenever she appeared in public. One shouted question lingered in her ears: "Are you stealing from your own daughter, Mrs. Hastings?" She returned home shaking, rage boiling beneath her grief. For the first time, she slammed her hands against Thomas's desk, the sound cracking through the study. "She is my daughter," she cried into the silence. "Why is she doing this to me?" The room gave no answer, only the echo of her pain. But then, Lily burst in with her laptop, breathless. "I found something," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. On the screen was an email leaked from Vanessa's account. A message to Victor Raines, subject line, "Next steps." In it, Vanessa wrote of how public pressure was turning beautifully, but warned that if my mother produces the trust, we'll need a fallback. Helen's eyes narrowed. "Fallback?" Dalton leaned closer. "They're planning more than headlines. They're preparing to challenge you directly, and if they can't destroy the trust, they'll try to destroy me," Eleanor finished, her voice barely a whisper. The days that followed were relentless. Tabloids published invasive stories about her health. Rumors spread that she was selling company assets in secret. None of it was true, but truth no longer mattered. The fortress Thomas had built was holding legally, yet in the hearts of strangers, it was already crumbling. And then came the broadcast that changed everything. A news station aired a special investigation into Hastings Group. Grainy footage showed Eleanor stepping out of her car, edited with ominous music. A narrator intoned, "Questions swirl around the widow who clings to a $250 million empire. Is Eleanor Hastings protecting her husband's dream or hiding from the truth?" The footage cut to Vanessa, tears glistening. "I only want to honor my father. My mother is lost in grief. She doesn't know what she's doing." Eleanor shut off the television, her hands shaking so badly she dropped the remote. She stumbled to the window, staring at the garden. The roses Thomas had planted glistened with rain, their petals bright, their thorns sharp. For the first time, Eleanor saw herself not as the fragile widow they painted, but as those roses scarred, stubborn, refusing to wilt. She whispered to the glass, "I will not be erased." The next morning, as she stepped outside to retrieve the paper, she froze. Spray painted across her front gate in bold red letters were two words: "Step down." Her breath caught in her throat. Neighbors slowed their cars to stare. A reporter snapped photos from across the street. Dalton rushed to her side. Helen arrived minutes later. Lily wiped the spray paint with her sleeve, fury burning in her eyes. "They've crossed the line," Helen said darkly. "This isn't just words anymore. This is intimidation." Eleanor gripped the gate, the paint staining her fingers red like blood. "Then it's time I stop hiding." She turned to Dalton, her eyes blazing for the first time in weeks. "No more silence. We take this to court. We show them the trust. We show them everything." Dalton hesitated, then nodded. "If you're ready, Eleanor, once we reveal it, there's no turning back." Her voice was steady. "I'm ready." That night, she sat alone in the study, Thomas's portrait watching over her. The trust papers lay spread across the desk, their ink gleaming under the lamplight. For the first time, she felt not just fear, but resolve. Yet as the clock struck midnight, her phone buzzed with a new message. No threats this time, just a single photo. A grainy shot of her sitting by the window earlier that evening, taken from outside. Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribs. Someone was watching her, not just the press, not just Vanessa's lawyers. Someone was closer. Her hands shook as she read the caption beneath the photo. "See you in court, Mother." The courthouse loomed like a fortress of its own, towering against the drizzling Seattle sky. Its marble columns glistened under the steady rain, and its steps were crowded with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers. For days, the city had buzzed with speculation about the Hastings trial, the battle for a $250 million empire between mother and daughter. This morning, every eye turned to see who would stumble first. Eleanor Hastings stepped from Dalton's sedan, the hood of her black coat shielding her from both rain and flashes of cameras. Microphones thrust forward instantly, voices sharp and insistent. "Mrs. Hastings, do you feel capable of leading a $250 million company? Are you denying your daughter her rightful inheritance? Have you considered retirement?" Each question was barbed, designed to wound. Eleanor kept her chin lifted, her eyes straight ahead. Every step she took up those slick courthouse steps felt heavier than the last. She could almost feel Thomas's hand at her back, urging her forward. Dalton walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Keep moving, Eleanor." "Not a word," he murmured. Inside, the courthouse was colder still. The long wooden benches creaked under the weight of journalists, investors, and strangers who had come to watch. The air thrummed with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were waiting to hear blood spilled. At the far table, Vanessa Hastings sat poised in a navy suit, her blonde hair gleaming under the lights. Beside her, Claudia leaned close, whispering something that made Vanessa smirk. Behind them stood Blackwood, the lawyer who had built his career on dismantling opponents with ruthless efficiency. His smile was thin, calculated, a predator's grin. Eleanor's chest tightened. Her daughter, her only child, looked at her not with love, not even with pity, but with hunger. "All rise." Judge Ramirez entered, his black robe flowing like a cloak of authority. He was known across Washington as a man both fair and unyielding. He took his seat, the gavel striking once. The trial began. Blackwood wasted no time. He strode to the center of the courtroom, his voice low but cutting. "Your Honor, this case is not merely about contracts or signatures. It is about legacy. It is about whether a grieving widow, fragile and unfit, can truly uphold what her husband built. Hastings Group, a $250 million powerhouse, deserves steady leadership, not sentimentality. And that leadership belongs to his daughter, Vanessa Hastings." Murmurs rippled across the gallery. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Fragile, unfit, words crafted to pierce. Blackwood continued, painting Eleanor as a woman lost in sorrow, unable to manage board meetings, unable to steer an empire. "The world has seen her decline," he said, gesturing subtly toward the row of reporters scribbling furiously. "This company cannot and should not be held hostage by grief." Dalton rose calmly when it was his turn. His voice was quieter but carried farther, like steel wrapped in velvet. "With respect, Your Honor, this case is not about grief, nor about opinion. It is about law." Thomas Hastings anticipated this very moment. He secured his company in an irrevocable trust, assigning Eleanor Hastings as sole trustee. That is not speculation, that is fact. He laid a thick folder of documents on the bench. The clerk carried them to Judge Ramirez, who began reading. The rustle of paper filled the silent courtroom. But Blackwood wasn't finished. He called Vanessa to the stand. She glided forward with practiced grace, taking the oath with a hand that did not tremble. "Miss Hastings," Blackwood began smoothly, "tell the court why you believe the company should be yours." Vanessa's voice quivered just enough to seem authentic. "I love my mother dearly, but she is not the woman she once was. Since my father's passing, she forgets things, repeats herself, drifts in meetings. Hastings Group is a living entity. It needs energy, vision, progress. My father always told me I was his heir. He wanted me to carry his dream forward." Her eyes shimmered with rehearsed tears. "I only want to protect his legacy." Eleanor's nails dug into her palms. Protect? Vanessa was rewriting history with the smoothness of silk. When Dalton stood for cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. His tone sharpened. "Miss Hastings, are you currently in debt?" Vanessa stiffened. No significant debt. Are you acquainted with a man named Victor Raines? Her gaze flickered. I know of him. Is it true you borrowed money from him or his affiliates? Blackwood leapt to his feet. Objection irrelevant. Overruled, Ramirez said firmly. Answer the question. Vanessa's lips parted, then closed again. Finally, she whispered, I don't recall. Dalton's eyes narrowed. Would it refresh your memory if I presented signed promissory notes linking you directly to Raines's holding companies? Gasps swept the room. Vanessa's composure faltered. Blackwood whispered furiously in her ear, but the damage was done. Dalton pressed further. And is it not true, Miss Hastings, that your creditors stand to gain if you gain control of Hastings Group? Vanessa's silence spoke louder than any denial. When Dalton finally presented the trust, the courtroom shifted again. The clerk passed the documents to Judge Ramirez, who studied them intently. Dalton's voice carried like a steady drumbeat. This trust is the final act of foresight by Thomas Hastings. He built not just a company, but protection against greed and manipulation. He entrusted his wife to carry it forward, knowing she alone could be steadfast in honoring his vision. This is law, Your Honor, binding and immovable. The weight of his words settled over the courtroom. Even reporters paused, pens still. Eleanor sat straighter, her heart steady. For the first time since the funeral, she felt Thomas's strength within her. She was not a frail widow. She was the fortress he had built. Court recessed for lunch. The gallery erupted with chatter as people spilled into the halls. Reporters rushed to phones, headlines already taking shape. Claudia leaned close to Vanessa, whispering urgently. Vanessa's eyes, however, darted toward her mother, no longer confident, but clouded with something like fear. Dalton leaned toward Eleanor. We've shifted the ground. They can't deny the trust. The law is on your side. Eleanor nodded, relief swelling but only for a moment. As she rose to leave, a man brushed past her in the aisle. His coat smelled faintly of smoke, his face shadowed beneath a brimmed hat. He leaned close, his words a whisper meant only for her. Careful, Mrs. Hastings. Fortresses hold against law, but not against blood. Some walls fall from the inside, and some stones bleed. Her heart froze. She spun to look, but he was gone, swallowed into the shifting crowd. Dalton noticed her pale face. Eleanor, what happened? She forced a breath, her hands trembling as she steadied herself against the bench. Nothing. Just the noise. But inside, she knew it was not nothing. It was a warning. That night, Eleanor sat in Thomas's study with Dalton, Helen, and Lily. The trust had held, the judge had listened, and the gallery had gasped at Vanessa's evasions. By every measure of law, it was a victory. Yet Eleanor could not shake the voice in her ear, the promise of blood, the shadow of Raines behind every headline. She looked at her friends, her allies, and whispered, Today, we won. But what happens when they stop fighting me in court? The room fell into uneasy silence. Outside, the rain pounded harder against the windows, as though the city itself knew the storm was only beginning. And as Eleanor blew out the lamp, one question haunted her more than any verdict. Would the next battle be fought in the courtroom, or in the dark streets of Seattle, where law could not protect her? The second morning of testimony drew a crowd so thick the courthouse doors nearly buckled from the weight of curiosity. Every bench inside was filled, every corridor humming with speculation. The battle for Hastings Group had become more than a family dispute. It had transformed into a public spectacle, the city of Seattle's favorite drama. Eleanor Hastings walked into the courtroom with the same steady pace she had rehearsed the night before in her mirror. Grief had aged her face, but there was a new steadiness in her eyes. She could feel Thomas's presence, as if his hand rested gently at the small of her back, urging her forward. Dalton walked beside her, carrying the fortress Thomas had built, the trust documents that had already rattled Vanessa's case. Behind them trailed Helen and Lily, silent pillars of support. Across the aisle, Vanessa sat stiffly, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Her navy suit looked impeccable, her hair perfectly smoothed, but her eyes betrayed her. They were restless, darting to the door, to the cameras, to the jury box, anywhere but her mother's face. Blackwood leaned close, whispering commands, his hand slicing the air in sharp gestures. Claudia sat just behind them, shoulders drawn tight, lips pressed in a thin line. All rise. Judge Ramirez entered, his gavel striking once. His voice, calm but heavy with authority, announced, "Court is now in session." Blackwood began his defense with renewed vigor, hoping to erase the sting of yesterday's revelations. He spun Vanessa's debts as temporary investments, calling them calculated risks taken by a visionary. His words were honeyed, but there was strain in his delivery. The gallery shifted restlessly, skeptical. Then Dalton rose, his tone even deliberate. "Your Honor, yesterday Miss Hastings claimed no significant debt. Today, we submit certified records of over $2 million owed to Victor Raines and his subsidiaries, debts secured with promises of inheritance that does not legally exist." He handed the documents to the clerk. The paper trail was undeniable. Contracts, signatures, timestamps. The courtroom buzzed like a hive. Pens scratched furiously. Cameras clicked in bursts. Judge Ramirez looked squarely at Vanessa. "Miss Hastings, do you acknowledge these debts?" Vanessa's throat worked as she swallowed. "They're temporary, my father always." "Answer the question," Ramirez pressed. Her voice cracked. "Yes, they're mine." The sound of it, the raw confession, landed in the room like a hammer blow. Eleanor's heart clenched. For years she had begged her daughter to stop, to slow down, to live within her means. Now the entire world was hearing what she had whispered in vain. Dalton pressed on. "And is it not true, Miss Hastings, that repayment of these debts hinges on gaining control of Hastings Group?" Vanessa's silence was damning. Blackwood jumped to his feet. "Objection! This is character assassination." "Overruled," Ramirez said sharply. "The witness will answer." Vanessa's lips trembled. "Yes." The gallery erupted in gasps. One woman in the back actually muttered, "My God." Eleanor lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She felt both vindication and devastation all at once. The truth she had prayed for had finally arrived, but it had come at the cost of watching her daughter undress her soul before strangers. And then Claudia moved. For the first time all morning, she stood. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched a small USB drive. "Your Honor," she said, her voice echoing in the hushed courtroom, "I have additional evidence." Vanessa whirled around. "Claudia, sit down!" But Claudia kept walking, her heels clicking across the floor like drumbeats. She handed the USB to the bailiff. "This contains a recording. It's a conversation I had with Miss Hastings. It reveals her true intent regarding this company." Blackwood barked, "This is outrageous! Unverified evidence." Judge Ramirez's gaze cut him down. "We will hear it." The bailiff plugged the device into the court system. A moment later, Vanessa's voice crackled from the speakers. "This company isn't about family. It's my ticket out. My mother can rot in it for all I care. Once I get control, I'll pay off Raines and never look back." The words rang through the chamber like a death knell. Reporters froze, pens hanging midair. A cameraman whispered, "Jesus." Gasps, mutters, and even a few curses rolled across the room like waves. Eleanor's body went rigid, though she had braced herself for betrayal. Hearing her daughter spit out those words, venom dripping, carved into her heart with surgical precision. Vanessa shot to her feet, her face contorted. "That was taken out of context. She twisted my words." Claudia finally turned to face her, her eyes glistening but her voice steady. "No, Vanessa, that was exactly what you said." "Traitor!" Vanessa shrieked, lunging toward her. Blackwood restrained her, hissing for her to sit. Judge Ramirez banged his gavel until the chamber stilled. His voice was thunder. "Order in the court." When silence finally returned, Ramirez spoke with deliberate gravity. This recording, combined with the financial evidence, cast serious doubt on Miss Hastings's credibility. The trust established by Thomas Hastings remains intact and binding. At this juncture, the daughter's petition stands on exceedingly weak ground. Vanessa collapsed into her chair. Tears streaked her makeup, her body trembling with anger, humiliation, and despair. Claudia turned away, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Dalton sat beside Eleanor, his tone hushed. "The fortress held. We've broken their attack." But Eleanor did not feel victorious. She watched her daughter crumble, watched the gallery feast on her downfall like wolves, and felt a hollow ache expand inside her. She had wanted truth, yes, but truth, when dragged into the light, was merciless. The gavel struck again. "Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning." The gallery burst into noise. Reporters rushed for the exits, phones pressed to ears, headlines already forming. Heiress exposed. Debt, lies, and betrayal in Hastings' trial. Dalton guided Eleanor toward the door. Helen flanked her on one side, Lily on the other. Cameras exploded as soon as they stepped outside. Voices shouted, "Mrs. Hastings, how does it feel to see your daughter exposed? Do you forgive her? Is this the end of Vanessa Hastings's career?" Eleanor kept her lips sealed, her heart breaking beneath her silence. That night, back at the mansion, the quiet was unbearable. She sat in Thomas's study, the fortress of documents spread before her, but her eyes blurred too much to read. She touched his old fountain pen, whispering, "Thomas, we won today, but at what cost?" Helen joined her, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "You protected what mattered. You honored his foresight." "I destroyed my daughter," Eleanor whispered. Helen shook her head. "She destroyed herself. You simply refused to hand her the match." Lily brought tea, her young face etched with both relief and concern. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Hastings. People finally see who Vanessa Island." But Eleanor wasn't sure if she wanted people to see that. She wanted her daughter back, not this stranger who bartered loyalty for money. The grandfather clock chimed midnight. The house groaned in the wind. Eleanor rose to close the curtains when her phone buzzed on the desk. A single text flashed on the screen. "You may have beaten her, but you haven't beaten me. VR." Her chest constricted. She read the message again, her hands trembling. Victor reigns. The court battle was tilting in her favor. But beyond the walls of law, beyond the fortress of paper Thomas had built, a darker war was waiting. She whispered into the quiet, her voice trembling but steady. "What will he take from me next?" The morning of the verdict dawned gray and heavy, as though the city itself held its breath. Rain slicked down the streets of Seattle, turning the courthouse steps into a stage where the entire city gathered. Reporters clutched microphones beneath umbrellas, their voices carried on live feeds across the country. Headlines scrolled endlessly. Judgment Day for Hastings Empire. Eleanor Hastings watched the scene through the tinted window of Dalton's car as it pulled to the curb. For weeks she had woken in dread of this moment, but now that it had arrived, she felt strangely hollow. It was not fear or relief coursing through her veins, it was something colder, harder, resolve. "Ready?" Dalton asked quietly beside her. His briefcase sat between them, the trust documents stacked neatly inside, the fortress Thomas had built with foresight. "As ready as I'll ever be," Eleanor said, her voice steady though her palms sweated against her coat. When the car door opened, flashes exploded instantly. The roar of voices crashed like waves. "Mrs. Hastings, are you prepared to lose today? Do you regret dragging your daughter into court? Do you feel unfit to run Hastings Group?" Eleanor kept her gaze fixed ahead. Helen and Lily flanked her like sentries as they ascended the slick marble steps. Dalton's hand hovered near her elbow, a steady anchor. She whispered to herself, "Thomas, walk with me now." Inside, the courtroom felt more crowded than ever. Every bench filled, aisles packed, the air thick with perfume, damp coats, and anticipation. Television crews hunched in the back, cameras already rolling. At the far table, Vanessa sat with her head bowed, her suit pressed but her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Blackwood leaned close, whispering something sharp into her ear, while Claudia sat a few seats behind, pale and withdrawn, as though she no longer belonged to either camp. "All rise." Judge Ramirez entered, his robe flowing, his gaze stern. The gavel struck once, and the hum of voices vanished into silence. "This court reconvenes to deliver its judgment in the matter of Hastings Group," Ramirez said, his voice even but heavy with consequence. "Before I render my decision, counsel may make brief closing statements." Blackwood was on his feet in an instant, striding to the center like a man stepping into spotlight. His voice rang smooth, polished, rehearsed. Your Honor, no one disputes that Hastings Group is a formidable company, a testament to the brilliance of Thomas Hastings. But brilliance requires continuity. Progress requires vision. My client, Vanessa Hastings, is the rightful heir, the living extension of her father's dream. What we see before us, however, is a grieving widow clinging to papers, clinging to sentiment, while the company risks stagnation. Hastings Group deserves more than to be a mausoleum to the past. It deserves life, and life belongs with Vanessa. He gestured toward Eleanor with a flourish. Can we truly entrust a $250 million empire to a woman too fragile to defend herself, without counsel, too overwhelmed by grief to even attend a shareholder meeting since her husband's death? A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled, eyes darting between Eleanor and the judge. Blackwood's voice dropped to a sympathetic tone, designed to sting. This is not cruelty, Your Honor. This is mercy for a woman who deserves peace, not burden. My client asks only to continue her father's legacy as he intended. To deny her would not just be unjust, it would be unnatural. When he sat, the gallery buzzed with energy. Vanessa lifted her chin slightly, a faint smile trembling at the corners of her lips as though hope had returned. Dalton rose slowly, smoothing his tie. His presence was less theatrical but far more grounded. His voice carried the weight of truth. Your Honor, what my colleague calls mercy is in fact manipulation. What he calls vision is debt. Let us remember the facts. Miss Hastings has borrowed millions from Victor Raines, a man whose name is synonymous with predatory lending. She promised him an empire she does not own, leveraged against her own mother's life work. That is not continuity. That is betrayal. He walked to the bench, placing the trust documents before the judge once more. His voice grew stronger with every word. Thomas Hastings anticipated this. He knew greed could corrupt. He knew ambition could be twisted. That is why he built this trust, not for sentiment, not for weakness, but for strength. The law recognizes it. It is irrevocable. It is binding, and it places Hastings Group in the care of his wife, Eleanor Hastings. Dalton turned, his eyes sweeping across the gallery, then settling on Ramirez. This is not about age, it is not about grief, it is about foresight and law, and the law is clear. Saturday silence followed, heavier than applause. Judge Ramirez folded his hands, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Hastings, would you like to make a statement before judgment is rendered? Every muscle in Eleanor's body screamed to remain seated, but slowly she rose. The gallery seemed to lean closer, hundreds of eyes burning into her. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. I did not choose this fight. I buried my husband, and before his grave was cold, I was forced to defend the life we built. Hastings Group was not founded on greed, nor on shortcuts. It was founded on dignity, on perseverance, on trust. My husband gave me this responsibility not because I begged for it, but because he knew I would protect it. That is what I will do, not for myself, but for the legacy he left and the future it can still create. Her eyes found Vanessa's. I never wished to battle my own daughter, but when blood turns to blade, a mother must still stand. Her words hung in the air. For once, even the reporters were silent. She sat, her chest heaving. Ramirez cleared his throat. His voice was calm but final. This court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and the binding legal trust. It is the judgment of this court that Hastings Group shall remain under the sole trusteeship of Eleanor Hastings. The petition of Miss Vanessa Hastings is denied. The gavel struck. Chaos erupted instantly. Reporters bolted for the exits, calling in stories to their editors. The gallery exploded with noise. Widow triumphs, one man shouted. Heiress falls, whispered another. Cameras flashed in bursts, capturing every trembling expression. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging. Relief washed over her, but it carried sorrow in its tide. She had won the war, but lost the child. Across the aisle, Vanessa collapsed into her chair. Her makeup streaked down her cheeks. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Blackwood leaned in, furious, but she shoved him away. Her voice cracked, rising above the din. You've destroyed me, Mother. The words hit Eleanor harder than any verdict. She wanted to rise, to cross the aisle, to take her daughter into her arms and whisper, "No, you destroyed yourself." But her body would not move. She sat frozen, tears pricking her eyes, while the marshals escorted Vanessa out a side door. Dalton placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over. You've won." But Eleanor whispered back, "Have I?" Outside, the courthouse steps had become a battlefield of cameras and voices. "Mrs. Hastings, how do you feel? Will you forgive Vanessa? What happens next for Hastings Group?" Dalton and Helen shielded her, guiding her through the throng. Lily pushed back microphones with surprising fierceness, but Eleanor felt suffocated by the noise. She longed only for silence. That night, the mansion on Queen Anne Hill stood still against the rain. Eleanor sat in Thomas's study, the judgment papers spread neatly before her. She traced her finger over his signature, whispering, "We did it, Thomas." The fortress held. Helen entered, setting a cup of tea on the desk. "You should rest. The worst is behind you." "Is it?" Eleanor asked softly. She looked at me like I'd killed her. Helen's eyes softened. "You saved the company. You saved his legacy. That is what matters." Eleanor shook her head. "What good is legacy if it costs your child?" Neither woman had an answer. Hours later, as midnight approached, Eleanor wandered to the window overlooking the garden. Thomas's roses glistened in the moonlight, their petals jeweled with rain, their thorns sharp. She touched the glass, whispering, "We survived the court. But what storm comes next?" Her phone buzzed on the desk. She picked it up, expecting another headline, but the message was unlisted. "The court may be closed, but the streets are not. VR." Her blood ran cold. She glanced toward the fog outside the window. The garden looked the same, and yet different, darker. Watched. Somewhere beyond the roses, unseen eyes lingered. Eleanor's breath quickened. The fortress had held in law, but outside these walls the war had only just begun. The storm that had brewed for months inside courtrooms and newspapers was finally quiet on paper. Judge Ramirez's gavel had fallen. Hastings Group was safe. Yet Eleanor Hastings knew better than to believe safety came from a judge's voice alone. She stood at the tall window of the mansion that night, her reflection a pale outline against the rain-slit glass. The message from Victor Raines still glowed on her phone. "The court may be closed, but the streets are not." VR. The words burrowed deep, colder than the November wind that rattled the shutters. She turned off the phone, but the message burned in her mind, echoing like a warning bell in the empty halls. The roses outside swayed in the wind, their thorns catching the moonlight like small blades. Eleanor thought of Thomas planting them decades ago, telling her, "They'll protect the house long after I'm gone." But could roses protect against a man like Raines? She moved through the study, her fingers grazing the leather of Thomas's old chair. Helen sat nearby, her coat still on, refusing to leave until Eleanor slept. "You saw the message?" Eleanor asked. Helen nodded. "Yes, I've known Raines for years. He doesn't make idle threats." Lily, perched on the arm of the sofa, looked ready to spring to her feet. "Then we don't wait. We get the police involved, expose his connections, the same way we exposed Vanessa's debts." Dalton shook his head. He stood by the fireplace, his face illuminated by the low flames. "The courts can handle contracts, trusts, property. But men like Raines, they thrive in shadows. They don't fear the law. They fear exposure. And he knows that now." Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter. "He's coming for me." "Or for her," Lily said softly, meaning Vanessa. The room fell silent. The thought struck Eleanor harder than any gavel. Despite everything, Vanessa's betrayal, her cruel words, the lawsuits, she was still her daughter. If Raines could not pry the company from Eleanor, would he turn to Vanessa, squeezing her until she broke completely? For hours they debated strategies, filing restraining orders, contacting federal authorities, hiring private security. But beneath every word lay the same fear. Raines would not be patient. At last Helen urged Eleanor upstairs. "You need rest. Tomorrow we plan. Tonight we survive." Eleanor obeyed, though sleep was a stranger that night. She lay awake listening to the creaks of the old house, the wind against the shutters, every sound amplified by dread. Just after 3 a.m., a knock rattled the front door. 3 sharp raps. Steady, unhurried. Eleanor froze in bed. Her breath caught. She knew that rhythm. It was the same as at the courthouse, when she had heard the echo of his voice without seeing his face. She slipped from bed, her bare feet brushing the cold wood floor. Down the hall, Lily appeared, her hair disheveled, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. Helen stepped from her guest room, phone in hand. Dalton emerged from the study, his face pale but his shoulders squared. The knocking came again. "Stay back," Dalton whispered. But Eleanor could not. Something in her bones pulled her forward. She descended the stairs, the others trailing. Her hand touched the banister Thomas had carved years ago, a reminder that this house had been built for storms. She opened the door a fraction. No one stood on the porch. Only a plain envelope lay against the threshold, rain soaking its corners. Dalton snatched it up, tearing it open. Inside, a single page. A company is only as strong as its weakest link. Blood is always the weakest. The signature at the bottom, VR. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. She whispered, "He'll use her, he'll use Vanessa." The rest of the night passed without another sound, but the unease never left. When dawn broke, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She called Vanessa. Her daughter didn't answer the first time, or the second. On the third attempt, a weary voice rasped, "What do you want?" Eleanor's throat tightened. "He's coming for you, Vanessa. Rains." He left a note. A bitter laugh came through the line. "Of course, Island, I owe him more than I can count. What do you care? You won, remember? You got the company. You got everything." "Not everything," Eleanor whispered. "Not you." For a long pause, neither spoke. Then Vanessa's voice broke, softer. "What do I do, Mom?" The word Mom pierced Eleanor like a blade and balm all at once. "You come home," Eleanor said firmly. "Come to the mansion. We'll face him together." By nightfall, Vanessa stood at the gates. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of arrogance, her expensive coat drenched from the rain. Her eyes carried fear Eleanor had never seen before. Mother and daughter faced each other in silence. Decades of love and betrayal pressed between them. Eleanor finally reached out, and after a heartbeat, Vanessa let herself be pulled into her mother's arms. Inside the mansion, plans began to form. Dalton contacted federal investigators. Helen drafted statements to the press, ready to expose Raines's threats. Lily dug into public records, connecting Raines's loans to offshore accounts. But as strategy buzzed around her, Eleanor sat quietly with Vanessa by the fire. The younger woman's hands trembled around her teacup. "I never meant for it to go this far," Vanessa whispered. "I just wanted to prove I wasn't weak." "You're not weak," Eleanor said softly, "but you let your fear choose for you. That's what made you vulnerable." Tears streaked Vanessa's face. "Do you still hate me?" Eleanor's heart ached. "I never hated you. I only grieved what we lost." For the first time in months, Vanessa leaned against her mother's shoulder, and Eleanor thought, maybe this is the beginning of repair. Days turned into a tense week. The newspapers shifted their tune. Widow defends legacy against mob ties. Headlines painted Raines as the predator, Vanessa as the fallen heiress, Eleanor as the survivor. Public sympathy, once so fickle, now flowed her way. But Raines was not a man to fade quietly. Late one evening, Helen rushed into the study holding her phone. "They found him," she said breathlessly. Raines was seen boarding a jet in Portland, destination unknown. Relief washed over them. Thin and fragile. Perhaps he had decided the fortress was too strong. Perhaps he had chosen another prey. Life at the mansion began to breathe again. The board at Hastings Group rallied behind Eleanor. Employees cheered her return. Even Vanessa began attending meetings, quieter now, humbler, her eyes often lingering on her mother with something like respect. One morning, Eleanor stood in the great hall addressing reporters. She announced the creation of the Hastings Foundation, a nonprofit arm dedicated to scholarships, community housing, and medical research, Thomas's dream reborn in her own hands. Applause filled the hall. Cameras flashed. For the first time, Eleanor felt not just victorious, but purposeful. She had not simply defended an empire, she had transformed it. That night, she returned to Thomas's study. exhaustion pulling at her bones. She lit a single lamp, casting a golden glow across his portrait. "We did it," she whispered. "We turned survival into legacy." Her phone buzzed again. A new message, unlisted number. She opened it slowly, breath catching. "Legacy is fragile. Be careful what doors you open. VR." The phone slipped slightly in her hand. She turned toward the window. Outside, beyond the roses, a figure lingered at the edge of the garden, motionless, watching. Her breath stilled. Was it shadow or man? The lamp flickered. The roses swayed, their thorns gleaming in the moonlight. Eleanor whispered, "Thomas, are we safe?" The figure remained. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. Eleanor gripped the window frame, her heart pounding. She had won the company, rebuilt her bond with her daughter, birthed the foundation. Yet the question lingered like smoke in the room. Had she truly escaped Victor Reigns? This story of Eleanor Hastings is more than a courtroom drama. It is a mirror held up to life itself. At its core, it asks what we truly inherit from those who came before us. Is it money, property, companies worth millions, or is it dignity, trust, and the courage to stand firm when the world tries to strip us bare? Eleanor's fight was not simply about protecting a $250 million empire. It was about protecting the meaning of love, loyalty, and legacy in a world where greed often disguises itself as ambition. The narrative reminds us that betrayal can cut deepest when it comes from within our own blood, yet it also reveals that even shattered bonds can hold the possibility of repair. Through Eleanor's strength, we see that resilience is not the absence of pain, but the ability to walk forward carrying it. Her decision to transform survival into the Hastings Foundation shows us that victory is hollow unless it is used to build something that outlives us, something that gives back. For anyone who has faced loss, disappointment, or betrayal, Eleanor's journey whispers a profound truth. You are not defined by what is taken from you, but by what you choose to protect and create in its aftermath. Her story is both warning and inspiration, a warning against the destructive power of unchecked ambition, and an inspiration to hold fast to integrity when the storm comes. In the end, the greatest value this story offers is hope. Hope that even in the darkest betrayal, one can carve out light. Hope that legacies built on trust will endure longer than those built on greed. And hope that, despite scars, love still has the power to return.